Hello and welcome to Miriam Ticktin from the New School for Social Research and but shortly moving to CUNY's Graduate Centre. Thank you very much for coming, Miriam.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talking to us about your fantastic work on invasive others and also your really interesting piece that you published recently in Signs. So there's some obvious COVID questions or COVID-related questions. So you've argued that fear of pathogens and viruses and the fear of foreigners and migrants are often superimposed on each other. Can you explain how this works?
Sure. Again, thanks for having me. So I think about the relationship between those two through the language of invasion. So invasiveness, immigrants are described as invasive and pathogens and are described as invasive. So it's actually a little bit about the way that language works. So first of all, invasion is a military term, right? So you're trying to fight against something trying to cross over into your territory. So it's an enemy that's trying to attack you, get over the ramparts. So invasion immediately has this idea of conflict, fight, struggle. And when something's invasive, it's trying to get in, an enemy trying to invade. So when you describe pathogens that way, you think of a virus trying to get into your body, and then you're trying to think of an immigrant that way, similarly trying to cross over the boundaries. I've written about it and thinking about the ways in which the language of invasiveness allows us to make to kind of think about the likenesses between different types of things that we would normally think of as on a different order. So you might say, pathogens and people shouldn't be compared, plants and people shouldn't be compared, but we also have invasive and native and invasive plants. Ideas are seen as invasive. So all of these, when we start talking about them as invasive, take on a similar quality. And so it can be, they're used like metaphors. And I think Bridget, your work has shown this in kind of really powerful ways, the ways in which, David Cameron talked about immigrants as kind of insects, as pests swarming and scuttling and so on. So that right away you think of those two in the same frame. And Trump has done the same, and he's talked about immigrants as animals that are invading. So you have this, they're similar on the level of metaphor, but I think what I'm interested in is once you compare them and you put them on the same plane in terms of metaphor, what does that then enable? And the idea is that I think it enables you to treat them in similar ways. So something, you can use similar technologies against them. So for instance, if you're talking about immigrants as insects or as animals, you cage animals, suddenly you can cage immigrants, which is exactly what Trump did. And I think, again, maybe more powerfully are what happens with languages like of pesticides, back to what you were talking about. And I think you've written about this again in really compelling and horrific ways, the ways in which the chemicals that were used to kill, like I said, Zyklon B, was that what it was? Used to kill, used in the concentration camps in World War II, was actually initially used as to delouse Mexican immigrants. So this idea that you then use something that for an invasive pest then and something else is invasive, you use that same thing on that person's. So I think that's the danger of the way invasiveness works. And I can say more, but I'm babbling on now.
No, it's really interesting. So how do you think this is played out in the specific case of COVID?
Yeah, well, I think, we all know that that the idea of the Chinese virus, right, the Wuhan virus, associating that with a certain kind of place and certain types of people has had really nefarious effects. There's been so much anti-Asian racism, a lot of violence against people who are seen of Asian or Chinese origin. And I think more broadly, this idea that somehow the virus is associated with otherness, with not whiteness, right, has enabled a very, very strong anti-immigrant discourse related to the COVID virus. So in the U.S., at least, people were being from Central America and South America, where there were no COVID cases, when they were in the US, were being deported because they were seen as somehow invasive and had COVID. But in fact, it was the Americans who had COVID and were actually exporting it to these places. So the idea was, oh, somehow they're invasive to us. But in fact, it was the Americans who had much more COVID and were passing it on that way. So yes, it's it's sticky and gets attached to different ideas of otherness and racial otherness in particular, obviously.
So that leads on to my next question, actually, which is, we've seen in the UK and the US and in many countries of the world a hardening of international borders, and really often an argument, not even an argument, an assumption that national borders are critical places within which you can that can be mobilized to limit the spread of infection. So how would you respond to somebody who might say, well, it's all very well, your romantic ideas, but actually these are ways that we can stop the spread of COVID?
Yeah, that one it's fascinating how it had stuck so quickly. And I think, quarantine as a medical strategy is thousands of years old. So it's quarantine is not the thing that I think that we need to question. It's the ways in which quarantine gets mapped onto national borders. Nation states are political entities. They're socially constructed concepts. So there's no reason that a nation state would be in itself safe, right? And that it would be medically pure, and outside of it wouldn't. It makes no sense to map the medical and the political onto one another. What you actually need to do is see how the virus is traveling, in what areas, in what communities, and you can quarantine if you need to there. That's the contact tracing stuff. But national borders are actually, by doing it by national borders, we're actually killing people, because nation states are spaces of immense inequality. So there's some people who are, when contained in the nation state, are actually being condemned to death because they're not getting healthcare, they don't have housing, they don't have jobs, and yet they're not allowed to move to get these things. So you think of people in detention centers and prisons and nursing homes, whatever, or even just in communities that are disenfranchised or precarious, and they're the ones who are dying. So by closing the nation state door, you're actually saying we are abandoning all, a huge number of our population in the name of, the people who mobilize the biggest set of resources, the richest. So I actually think it's an incredibly dangerous strategy that people have used, and it has worked. When a nation state is based on the principles of equality, and that the state actually does something in terms of providing infrastructure and healthcare and education, then maybe you can control it different ways. So I think of New Zealand, obviously, or even South Korea, who've done very well on that. But otherwise, it makes no sense to map kind of medical quarantine onto political quarantine. It just makes no sense.
But isn't the home also a political space? So what about quarantine in the home? Aren't you guilty, or not you personally, but isn't one guilty of the same fallacy when thinking about the home?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, the nation state and the home are two things that are mapped onto one another. One's a political home, the other one is supposedly an intimate home. And both have been shown to be incredibly unsafe. And certainly kind of feminist theory has shown for a long time how unsafe the home is. That's what made, the whole feminist idea of the personal is political, because the personal was where a lot of violence happened, right? And a lot of subjugation and oppression. So we see the rates of domestic violence rising under COVID, because people are stuck inside in their so-called homes where they're supposed to be safe. So yes, I think it behooves us to question all these ideas of so-called spaces, safe spaces, home spaces. I think, we need to question what they mean and what they contain. Yeah.
So one of the bits in your article that I really love, and I can't quote it, but you express it really nicely, is that, we need to think about what connections we should be wary of, such as the home and the nation, and which connections we want to nurture and attend to. And I thought that is actually, I found that really helpful to think with, you know, what connections do I want to nurture and attend to? So I wondered if you could give us some examples of those connections that you feel should be treated, acknowledged and treated with care.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, partly first, I wanted to be clear that I'm not trying to be utopic on that. I feel like one of the things that the virus has revealed is that we are intimately connected. We cannot separate ourselves from each other. We breathe the same air, we drink the same water, we share viruses, we share microbes, we share bacteria. So we cannot, I think it has been revealed in the most intense way that we are connected, that we actually cannot be the individual autonomous kind of monads that liberalism would want us to be. So then the question is, what kinds of connections should we cultivate? Are people cultivating? And I actually started the signs piece thinking about what people were doing because I think in the face of it all, people were incredibly creative in thinking about ways to come together that were actually healthy and encouraged flourishing as opposed to death, right? So I kind of talk about three different things, and one of them I'll say is this idea of shared resources. One of the things that has killed people during the COVID is inequality, right? So anything that cultivates equality is actually cultivating a kind of a good way to be together in some sense. And so this was just a very minor little, in some ways minor project. And I'm kind of looking at my window because I can almost see one out here, but it's this idea of free fridges. So they're just refrigerators that are put out on the street and plugged into cafes or little bodegas, stores, restaurants, and people stock them, and anybody can put in. And the idea is that you don't have to be deserving. If you need food, you take it whenever you need it. And if you don't have food, if you're not using it, you put it in there. And so it's a way to manage waste and to redistribute goods. So that was one of these projects of shared resources, of an idea of a commons where people share the kind of their communities and the resources of the communities, and don't do it for profit, but do it precisely because you take what you need and that's it, right? So that's been a wonderful experiment, and they have just been growing and growing, and clearly there's need. There's another one, and I think this is one we're all familiar with, but the idea of pods and bubbles. In the UK, are you calling them bubbles?
Yeah.
Bubbles more. So here they're pods. And the idea is, of course, again, to question back to our idea of the family and the home is who do you share your space with, and who do you share your intimacy with? And I think what I thought was really interesting, the experiments I saw about this was that it was based less along the lines of biological relationships, family relationships, heteronormative relationships, and more along the lines of queer families we choose. So you're next door to me and we share a yard. Let's become a bubble and eat together and share our resources in some senses create a space where we don't have to wear masks, but we all tell each other where we've been and reveal and be transparent about where we are going and so on, so that we don't put each other at risk. So there are these kind of relationships that are forming that aren't about regular kind of so-called normative intimacies, but are based on kind of, oh, you need childcare, I need childcare. Yeah, I like your outdoor space, or I really like you and I want to have a bubble with you for the next 6 months. And so I think there are these wonderful new communities being formed. I see amongst young people taking care of older people, just really fascinating new combinations of relationships. So that's another thing I think people are coming, and they're doing it in ways that are very the risks are high, because if you do something and don't tell people and you expose yourself, you kill your pod or your bubble. This is stuff that people who are the pioneers of kind of the ACT UP and so on AIDS movement know this very well. They know how to be together and have pioneered these ideas of sharing and being together in ways that are not contagious. But I think this is a new form of it. Yeah, and it affects more people, obviously. So that was another one, and the last one was about, in some senses, the ways in which people came together to protest. And this was during kind of Black Lives Matter, and it's ongoing, I think, all over the world, obviously. But I participated in New York City, so I'm most familiar with it. But it was the ways in which, even in a pandemic, people came together to protest the kind of the police killings and murders of people of color, and got out into the street and created these collectives that I've been thinking of as mobs, but mobs in the best sense of mobility. We were walking together, being together in ways that are respectful. So people weren't close to each other. Everybody was wearing a mask, but nonetheless, people came together in all different forms from all different walks of life to protest this. And I think it was in the movement themselves that they created new political collectives, different ways to be together across class, race, gender, sexuality, and so on. So those were the three examples, but I'd love to hear about other ones that people are engaged in. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thanks ever such a lot, Miriam. That's very inspiring, and yeah, gives us lots to think with. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for talking about it.